Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries. I'm your host John, and today we're going to be looking at another Lamentations of the Flame Princess module. Okay, so in this review we're looking at the Lamentations of the Flame Princess module Wight Power by Alex Mayo. Now, before some of you start spontaneously combusting and trying to get me cancelled on Twitter or whatever, this is Wight, spelled W-I-G-H-T, so it's referring to the type of undead creature that is common in D&D. Now, do I think this was the ideal choice for a title of a module? Possibly not. I mean, it does fit with the whole Lamentations aesthetic of sort of thumbing their nose at authority and at popular culture, and maybe any sort of controversial publicity is a good thing. Who knows? I'm not a massive producer of RPG material like they are, so maybe they know something I don't. But to me, it just seems a bit of an unnecessary sort of controversy stirred up over really nothing. And as I'll talk about later, the actual wight, the undead mentioned in this module, seems like a bit of a sort of secondary thought or an afterthought. It mainly seems to be dropped in there to justify the title, but that's just my opinion. However, the module itself is actually pretty interesting, and I think it'd be unfortunate if it was overlooked because of an incendiary title. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's just get on to talking about what actually is in the module rather than what isn't. Okay, so we start off with a table of contents, and on the opposite page there is a picture of a sort of skull with like a burning red nimbus around it, and it's done in this almost sort of paper cutout style with like large blocked out areas of solid colour, and that seems to be the art style that has been kept through the rest of the book. Whilst I wasn't sure about it at first, it actually grew on me, and by the end of it I was really enjoying some of the images that are in there. So table of contents moves on to a background, and we get a sort of breakdown of roughly what has occurred before this adventure and leading into the point where the player characters get involved. And obviously, before I go any further, we're going to be talking about what goes on in the module, so consider this your spoiler warning. In essence, this module involves the preserved holy prepuce, which is basically the foreskin of Jesus Christ, and how it passed through a number of religious hands before eventually ending up in the hands of a Catholic called Father Joseph de Vernay. Unsure of what to do with his incredible find, he consulted an old friend, a Spanish adventurer named Alfonso Gutierrez. The Spaniard was a devout Catholic, but also he delved into some like fairly dank occult shit. But Gutierrez persuaded his friend that he'd come across this strange tome called the Clavis Inferni, or the Key to Hell, written centuries ago by Saint Cyprian of Antioch, the so-called saint of necromancers, and it had the knowledge to return someone from the dead as long as you had a bit of their sort of physical essence or their remains lingering behind. I'm sure you can see where this is going. So they began the creation of this arcane artificial womb, I suppose you could call it, with the stated aim of bringing back the King of Heaven to the mortal realm. Gutierrez brought in a small companies of mercenaries, German Langsknecht, apologies if I've got that wrong, to provide security, and he also used them to off the people who'd done the sort of work on the Isle of Wight, again another link to the name, to sort of like prepare the surroundings so they couldn't tell anyone about it. We're then told that although everything seems to be going sort of smoothly with the plan at the start, eventually the people working on it start to make mistakes. Paranoia starts growing amongst the Landsknecht and the religious people and workers, the acolytes of Diverney, who are working on this wound, and it's sort of like a struggle of wills building between the two sides in the area. This tense state of affairs is exacerbated when a member of Divernay's order disappears shortly after one of the Landsknecht is murdered, and well, they join the dots, and it's a bit of a powder keg waiting to go off, and this is the situation when the adventure begins. We're told that really what's actually happening is this artificial womb and the strange sort of monstrous creature that's growing in it is actually sort of draining the mental energy of the people in the surrounding area in an ever sort of widening bubble. This is causing people to become paranoid, overly emotional. They're starting to make slip-ups with their arcane and religious calculations, which is further exacerbating the effect. And because of all these mistakes they've made, effectively what is going to be born out of this artificial wound isn't the redeemer of man. It's this monstrous mutated creature that bears some sort of DNA similarities with the original donor, and it has a fraction of its powers, but it is certainly not the second coming. Unbeknownst to the people on the island, abbey ruins on the island house caverns that contain the bodies of many massacred followers of the island's original pagan culture, slaughtered in 686 AD by Cadwalla of Wessex after he conquered the island and brought it under the dominion of Christ. The psychic emanations that are running rampant on the island have awakened a spectral horror of pure hate, the Wight, a sort of spiritual creature capable of possessing people. It possessed a member of the order named Matthew Crevier, who killed the Landsknecht mercenary, albeit not of his own volition, when he discovered Crevier secretly digging a tunnel into the burial caves. The Wight is using Crevier to unearth it so that its army of undead and its true horror can be unleashed upon the world. Next we get a timeline of events starting at 5 BC with the birth of Jesus Christ and finishing in March 1632, which is shortly before the player party arrives on the scene. We then get a section which lists the various NPCs, starting with Father Joseph de Vernay, this person who is desperately trying to ensure the success of the endeavour. He thinks that maybe the disappearance was a revenge murder by the Landsknecht, and he's begun to sort of see the presence of them as a two-edged sword. He's not happy about the power Gutierrez wields, but he hopes the hiring of the party will resolve the mystery of the murder before things get too out of control. He's an Englishman by birth but of French descent, and returned to his family's native country as a young man to seek training as a Jesuit priest, returning to England to subversively promote the Catholic cause. He settled on the Isle of Wight in 1618. We then have a breakdown on the Order of St. Cyprian of Antioch, or more simply the Order, a group of fanatical Catholics who have flocked to de Vernay's cause. Alfonso Gutierrez, this tall, slender man who is the Spanish friend of the priest. He's convinced that he's a tool of destiny and believes his life has inexorably led him to this moment. And he has a couple of strange little magical possessions on his person. We have Rolf Bargel, a 43-year-old short and stocky man with a gruff and taciturn demeanour who leads the Landsknecht. And then we have some generic stats for those as well. And all of these are accompanied by that same sort of striking, very graphically inspired artwork, which I'm actually really enjoying. We get a section on running the adventure, which discusses how the PCs are to be bought into the adventure. Although we don't really get a great deal of options here, we're pretty much told that de Vernay has hired the group to find the people responsible for killing the murdered priest in an effort to defuse the situation. He thinks because the player characters are a neutral party, they'll be less prone to accusations of bias. We get a 2-page spread with a D20 rumour table for what the players might have heard about the Isle of Wight before they go there, and the area surrounding Carr Abbey, which is where all of this takes place. Love a rumour table, and obviously it tells you if they're true or false, but it's a good way to get people some information. Just throw a few rumours to your players so they have a bit of background to go on, but they don't have to do a lot of research to get into the game. We get a couple of little diagrams showing the sort of coast of the Isle of Wight and zooming in on the Solent, the area around Carr Abbey and Fishburn. We're told what happens when the players arrive, so they'll immediately become subject to this sort of mind and life draining effects of the womb, how they're met by Gutierrez or possibly de Vernay. They get introduced to all the various sort of players in this drama. Rolf Bargeld is reticent and disagreeable, but grudgingly helpful. He thinks that his men should be able to deal with this, but sort of in the back of his mind, he really knows that it's good to have a neutral party on board. And we get some bullet points of the information that these NPCs can give them. We're told that Duvernay himself is in a state of high anxiety, disturbed by the murders, the disappearance of Harding, and all of that's being ramped up by the effect of the womb. He's starting to regret his initial fervour about this idea. And the author makes it clear that Wight Power is not a murder mystery. He says you could run it that way, and the setup makes it look like that. However, the main thrust of this adventure is to pique the party's curiosity, give them a site to explore, and then let them run wild over it under the auspices that they are going to be able to locate this Wight and investigate this murder. The secondary crux of it is the interactions between all these different groups in this emotional powder keg that's forming. We're told to pay special attention to reaction rolls every time the party interacts with someone, no matter how minor. The rolls gaining a -2 penalty, and this is on the sort of standard BX 2d6 reaction table. You get a -2 penalty because of the wound's parasitic effect on everyone's mind, including the player characters. We're told that while the party is at camp, the tensions between the two groups, Duvernay and the Order on one side, and Gutierrez and the Landsknecht on the other, will continue to escalate. Each day the party stays at the quarry, there is a 50% chance of an altercation breaking out. If the party is being particularly lax in the investigation, you might want to forgo that roll and just have them go straight to the thumpage. If a conflict does break out, we're given a random D6 roll table to determine which sides are involved in the conflict. But the actual nature of the disagreement and the precise effect can be finessed by the GM to suit how the adventure is unfolding for their group. As the players continue their investigation, eventually clues will lead them to Matthew Crevier, who is the person causing all this distrust to begin with. He's still at large and under the influence of the Wight, plans to set loose an army of undead on the camp. Currently he is excavating a tunnel entrance to the caves below the abbey. His mind is pretty warped. The Wight has been pulling his strings for weeks now. He's already committed a couple of murders, and the area he's digging was marked unsafe early in the catacombs construction. So most of the NPCs avoid it, and that gives him the privacy he needs to continue with his nefarious plans. Although if the player party are being a little bit more diligent in monitoring these areas, they may spot him. Should Clavier be killed or otherwise sidelined, the Wight will abandon him and attempt to wrest control of another nearby character. This might even be a player character at your discretion. Once free of the Wight's control, he will agonise over the deaths he caused and Crevier will explain he had no idea why he had such a compulsion to dig below the catacombs. If Crevier is not disturbed, then 48 hours after the player party arrive on the site, he will break into the burial chambers. When this occurs, the Wight and its army of animated corpses, there's stats for the Wight later on, will clamber out of their tomb and begin to kill every living soul within reach. Obviously this causes all manner of problems and changes the tone of the scenario entirely. As we've mentioned earlier, the Order have kind of effed up with their plan to rebirth the saviour of mankind, and instead of the second coming, a horrific creature that is the product of occult and bizarre science births its way from the womb after 72 hours. This three-headed, gelatinous creature with strange mental powers. Then we get a page called Aftermath, which describes what might occur. Once the embryonic sort of Christ creature is born, it continues to broadcast this strange mental effect, sapping the mental fortitude of people in a widening area. Obviously, if it gets loose once it's fully birthed, this effect will eventually spread to cover the whole world, causing widespread and serious problems. At first, people will lose the ability to speak foreign tongues, making trade more difficult. Practitioners of the occult and academics will find studies more difficult. things really start to go bad once people lose the ability to read and write their native language. Whilst this probably isn't a problem for the average peasant who doesn't rely on such things, so those amongst the educated and ruling classes will suddenly find themselves cut off from the information they need to govern and work effectively. Centre of learnings in particular being heavily impacted. Killing the creature will negate all accumulated effects, penalty stability scores, saving throws, and all of that malarkey. However, experience points gains will return to normal, but any lost experience points are gone forever as a permanent side effect of the creature's strange mental draining powers. The only good news really in this scenario is that the creature has no way off the island and is more a beast of blind rage than one of cunning. Tracking it down won't be too difficult, and theoretically if people can track it down before they're debilitated too much by the psychic effects, they can take it out, although that poses its own difficulties. We then go on to a section called Locations, where we get a description and a lovely map for Carr Abbey. That goes on for a number of pages describing what you will find there. We get a map and description of the catacombs. This is all pretty much your standard dungeon fare, although again the artwork is great in this. And of course in the catacombs in area 11, that's where we find the womb, where this strange artificial sort of creation birthed by the Clavis Inferni is draining the mental fortitude of everyone in the area, ready to birth this monster. We get a small map of the pagan cairns, where the Wight and its undead hordes lurk, and there is a beautiful 2-page spread, again done in this graphic style, that shows these like 3 obviously undead creatures with this like almost red lightning coming out of their eyes. And given there's only 3 colours and pretty basic shapes used in this, I think the artist has done a great job. Because I mean, you look at this and you're instantly like, well, they're undead. I think that's absolutely brilliant. Then we move on to a series of appendices, one of which describes the effects of the artificial womb and the creatures in more detail. So we're told that there are effectively 4 stages of effect. Stage 1 is an 8% drain on all experience points earned, spell failure chance of 10%, and a reaction roll modifier of -2. And that's pretty much what the effect is going to be like when the player characters arrive on the scene. Stage 2, 10% drain on XP earned, spell failure 15%. All character skills lose 1 pip, which is obviously a mechanic that people who play Lamentations will be familiar with. A -1 penalty on saving throws versus magic. You lose 1 non-native spoken and written language. The reaction modifier steps up to a -3. Stage 3 is a 12% drain on XP, spell failure 20%. All characters lose 1 pip. A -1 penalty on saving throws versus magic. Intelligence and wisdom scores drop by 1 each. You lose 1 non-native spoken and written language, and the reaction modifier stays at -3. The final stage, stage 4, sees a 15% drain of XP. Existing experience points begin to drain at a rate of 1% per month, so you actually start losing XP you've already gained. Spell failure goes up to 25%. All character skills lose 2 pips. There's a -2 penalty on saving throws versus magic. Intelligence and wisdom drop by 2 each. You lose 1 non-native spoken and written language and lose the ability to read or write one's native language. And the reaction modifier steps up to a -4. We then get some stats and some details on what this calls the embryonic Christ, a 3-headed creature, which seems more reminiscent of John Carpenter's The Thing than the Redeemer of Mankind. It has 3 heads, each of which has a psychic power. The first one being vampiric thaumaturgy. It can steal memorized spells from people. The second is divine suppuration. It brings forth a massive pus-filled boil on the target creature's body that bursts, spraying toxic goo everywhere. And the third is precognition, giving it a limited form of understanding of what its opponent's actions are going to be before they actually make it, giving it a sort of advantage on initiative and stuff like that. It has magic resistance and is a pretty tough customer, although this is an adventure based for low-level parties, so it's not too ridiculous. We get a lovely box out here as well where it says, oh, well, if they're trying to clone Jesus Christ, why not simply use the clone spell? And as the author says here, The way the clone spell works in Lamentations is the caster pulls in the spirit to inhabit the body from one of the original being's alternate timelines. However, as described in here, there's only one Messiah who exists in all timelines simultaneously. A simple clone spell won't work because there's no alternate timeline to pull his spirit from. And I think that's a very neat little way of sidestepping a sort of way that some smart Alex might come up with to try and get around this. We then get a description of the Wight, a being that we're told is not truly undead, but instead a being of pure energy created from the lingering hatred and anger in the pagan tomb beneath Car Abbey. We get some stats for it. We're told how its possession works, and for the zombies that it can raise from the pagan caverns. And as I said at the very start of this flip through, my only sort of slight issue is I think the Wight could have been made more of. It almost seems to be included as an afterthought. The main plot line seems to centre around the birthing of this infernal Christ-like monstrosity, and then the Wight just seems to have been chucked in afterwards as like an additional sort of thing, if you want a few zombies, or as I said, perhaps just to justify the title of the module. Now, which I think is a shame, because the actual write-up of the Wight in the appendices is actually pretty interesting, changing a fairly standard undead into this menacing spiritual presence that acts through other people's, a sort of unseen spiritual puppet master. And I think that a lot more could have been made of that. Obviously, as a GM, you can always put more of that in yourself if you want to, but I just think it's a shame that it was sort of seemingly thrown in as almost like a bit of an afterthought. I might be wrong in this sense, but that's how it came across to me when I was reading it. We get some details on the Clavis Inferni, the grimoire of St. Cyprian of Antioch, and there's some genuinely interesting, faux historical, because it's based on historical, but not really in terms of the module, information in there, and some recommendations of stuff you can go and check out, as well as obviously the effects on how it works in games, containing certain spells and sort of rituals in it that you can use. We then get a nice table of NPC names and traits, which gives you male and female names, surnames, male and female German first names and surnames, a 2d20 table of distinguishing characteristics, and then we have a list of inspirational music and a very pithy afterword at the end, before closing out with a quite a disturbing little sketch of this Christ abomination. So, what did I think of the module? Well, putting aside the slightly incendiary title that, to be honest, doesn't really bother me, because it's obviously, I don't know if you can call it clickbait because it's written material, but that's the sort of vibe I get off it. So I can just set that to one side. I'm not bothered about that. And it doesn't actually feature anything really troublesome unless you have problems with the religious elements in it. But if you have problems with religious elements, you're probably not reading a Lamentations of the Flame Princess module, because they tend to go in for that cult stuff pretty hard. But I actually thought this was pretty interesting. As the author themselves says, it has all the sort of appearances of being a murder mystery, but it's really not. It's a sort of site-based adventure where you're encouraged to explore under the sort of threat of this timer, this pressure cooker of these disparate groups that are sort of working together for a common goal, but are slowly starting to fall apart under the influence of their own suspicions and outside forces. So it's pretty much, like I say, it's a location-based dungeon crawler, but you have the additional wrinkle of there is a very definite time limit set on it as things start to escalate and the wheels start to fall off the wagon, so to speak. It's also a great example of an adventure that is isolated. There's only a few sort of locations in it, so it's pretty easy for a more novice or an experienced GM to get a grasp of. And I think this would be a great adventure if you want to dip your toe into running modules where there's different sort of social groups and interactions that you have to keep track of. It's manageable. There's only a few different groups, a few little locations, so very easy for a more inexperienced GM in that sort of area to manage. but also there's potentially a lot of complexity in this, but only if you want to delve into the interaction between the groups and expand on it. If you want to keep it as just a simple dungeon crawler, you can, but there is a lot of potential for much more in this module. And as with the other Lamentations of the Flame Princess module I reviewed a short time ago, I really do think these adventures allow you to take as a little or as much as you want from them, making them as complex or simple as you prefer. And that, to me, is the mark of a great module. So if you're not bothered by the title, you love a bit of a dungeon crawler, you want a book with some interesting, really cool graphic art styles in, an interesting look at religion and the lengths people might be willing to go to if they think the ends justify the means, then you could do far worse than picking up a copy of this module. It's available on the Lamentations of the Flame Princess website in print and PDF format. At the time of recording this, it's going for €27.50, which is just over £22 in British money and just over $30 US. I really think if you're looking for a self-contained adventure with some great artwork and some interesting moral dilemmas, you should check this out, particularly if you love the way that Lamentations delves into like religion and cults and things like that. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. If you have, like, share, subscribe, and all of that good stuff that YouTubers and podcasters are always asking you to do. If you'd like to comment on it, or you'd like to get involved in any sort of discussion about RPGs, maybe tell us what you thought of this review or our conclusions, then you can get in touch a few different ways. You can leave us a voicemail message on Anchor or SpeakPipe, there'll be links in the descriptions, or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you again, take care, stay safe, and whatever you're playing, have fun.